Hi, my name is Nicola Jennings. I'm Director of Colnaghi Foundation. Welcome to Colnaghi Foundation Lates, talks with interesting people about new art exhibitions, publications and events in the UK and around the world.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the third in our series of Colnaghi Lates. My name is Jeremy Howard from the Colnaghi Foundation, and I'm joined by Desmond Shaw-Taylor, who is Curator of the Royal Collection and Surveyor of the Queen's Pictures. Our subject this afternoon is George IV as a collector, and our conversation coincides with the current exhibition at the Queen's Gallery, George IV Art and Spectacle, which has been extended beyond the 3rd of May and will reopen as soon as is possible as a result of the coronavirus crisis. So, Desmond, our first image of George is this slide shows George painted by George Stubbs as a relatively young man. We tend to think of him as a sort of rather fat elderly man. Desmond, what does this painting by Stubbs tell us about George and his interests?
Well, I think this is George IV as Prince of Wales, as the daring radical, dressed in the uniform of the supporters of the American Revolution, the buff breeches and blue coat, and he's riding in a public park. It's not you'd expect it to be Windsor Great Park or something accentuating his royal status, but it's not. It's Hyde Park. It's a public park. And he's dressed entirely as a man of fashion. The only thing that would tell you that he's perhaps a bit more than that is the Garter star, on which he's wearing on his breast. But otherwise, it's very much George IV as I think the man that is throwing himself into the life of the town, not a characteristic prince at all.
But you said he was dressed in as it were, the uniform of the supporters of the American Revolution, and I know he was sympathetic towards the French Revolution before things started to get very ugly indeed, with the terror in 1793. Wasn't this rather a radical stance to be taken, given his father's political position?
Completely. I mean, it's a pretty good old tradition amongst the Hanoverians for the eldest son to do everything in their power to annoy their father, and George IV just took it to another level. And as you say, I mean, you're referring to the French Revolution. The portrait is dated 1791, so it belongs in the post-revolutionary period, but it's in that kind of honeymoon period of the French Revolution where all English liberals tended to be very enthusiastic about the revolution and feel that our last France has sort of caught up with the idea of liberty and constitutional monarchy. Before, as you say, it all went horribly wrong.
So this is an image of him as a very young man, and our next slide shows him much later on in life. And this is an establishment image, isn't it, Desmond?
Yeah, and this is, I suppose, one of the narratives which comes over in this exhibition, or indeed any treatment of George IV, is the sort of characteristic transformation from the kind of hippie to the staid grown up. And this is the coronation portrait by Sir Thomas Lawrence, and it's absolutely the most bling thing that you could possibly imagine, the most formal, the most stately, with the regalia designed by himself, George IV.
How very interesting that he designed the regalia himself. Yeah.
His Queen Caroline rather scornfully said that was what he was best at.
And isn't there something sort of funny about a halo around the head or something? Did Lawrence sort of paint something out? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about this portrait is that it's actually painted over, rather surprisingly. You'd think if a coronation portrait, you'd make a nice fresh start, but it's actually painted over a portrait in garter robes. So the coronation robes are added over the top. I don't think that necessarily gives rise to the halo around the head. I think those halos often occur because when artists are painting the head, they put a little bit of colour behind just to set the head off, and then they paint all around the area of the head, and often therefore paint, as it were, twice around the immediate area around the head, and you get these changes of colour over the years. I think that's the most likely explanation for that. I don't think it's just a delusion of sanctity though that's possible too with our subject.
And then the crown is resting rather symbolically on a table. Can you tell us a little bit about that table?
Yeah, this is the table of the Grand Commanders, the Grand Capitaine, which was created by the Sèvres porcelain manufactory in France in about 1806, I think it was, for Napoleon. And it's one of a series, and this one contains the great captains, the great commanders of antiquity, with Alexander the Great in the middle and various Roman and Greek generals around the outside, so Caesar, Scipio, Africanus, these sorts of people. And it was given, I mean, Napoleon obviously never took delivery of it, or did not take delivery of it, and it was given by the restored Louis XVIII to George IV as a kind of thank you present for restoring him to his throne. So it's profoundly symbolic. It's taken away from the usurper, it's repossessed by the rightful King of France, and then it's given by the rightful King of France in gratitude to the King of Great Britain. So it couldn't be more symbolic. And George IV insisted that it occur in all official portraits, so hence its presence in the coronation portrait.
So do you think that the placement of the crown on top of the table is saying something about Britain being top dog in the world and having overthrown Napoleon?
I think certainly there would be an element of that. I mean, the symbolism of a table with Alexander the Great in the middle, which obviously Napoleon intended it to be symbolic of his supremacy over Alexander the Great, because another one in the series had Napoleon in the centre, so Napoleon is sort of setting him up against this very august predecessor. And then I suppose George IV is kind of trumping it with, as you say, with the English crown.
We now move to an image of a much younger George as the infant Prince of Wales with his younger brother and his mother in a room, I think, in what is now Buckingham Palace. What does this picture perhaps indicate about the future direction of his tastes and how his mother might have influenced him?
Well, you see the young George, a little boy, in his mother's dressing room, and he's surrounded by, obviously, what is rather a sumptuous setting, and in the background you see two, perhaps, potentially things which might have interested him. One is a Rococo French long case clock, when he was to collect similar in his collecting career. But perhaps most significant of all, behind Queen Charlotte's head, you see two nodding Chinese figures. So maybe this was the first inspiration for his love of everything Chinese.
And of course we see lots of these nodding figures if you go to the Royal Pavilion today. I think they were sort of things that came in and sort of into fashion in the middle of the 18th century, didn't they? But
yes, exactly. And you do see a little bit of that influence of Queen Charlotte. It also occurs with Sèvres porcelain, but generally the principle, which she also collected, but generally the principle is if Queen Charlotte bought one of something, George IV bought 20.
Yes, and I think he also bought a few things from her collection when it came up for sale.
Yes, which I think that's perhaps more an expected act of filial piety, I think I would have said.
And I suppose another thing about this picture is that George is shown in fancy dress. He enjoyed dressing up and being rather theatrical, didn't he?
Yes, and again, I mean, I think he would have been dressed like that by his governess rather than himself. He's dressed in a costume from Fénelon's Télémache, so he's a little sort of classical figure of Telemachus. But it's certainly, he carried on enjoying dressing up like that for the rest of his life. Yes, he did.
Good. And then if we move to the next slide, filial piety. Now, I think George was fond of his mother, but not particularly fond of his father. Is that the case?
Yes, certainly. And there is also a lot more at stake when you're heir to the throne and a king. A lot more political matter going on between the two. This is, I mean, one of the things that's characteristic about the exhibition is and George IV's collecting is that he liked caricatures. He collected caricatures, including caricatures of himself. Sometimes he bought whole sets in order to suppress them, so that it wasn't entirely for love. Sometimes it's a species of censorship. But one of the things that the exhibition tries to do is to chart various attitudes towards George IV by the use of caricature. And this is George IV as the dissolute, careless son, unfilial. At the time of the Regency crisis in 1788, so he's been out on the town with his political friends, and he arrives, first thing in the morning, drunk, bursts into his father's bedroom and says, I wonder if the old fellow's dead or not, but the dead is crossed out, so you have to guess it.
And isn't there a picture frame which seems to have written on it, "The Prodigal Son," just to the left of the bed?
Yes, that's another caricature, exactly. So he but I think also you can see in this caricature something we saw in that Stubbs portrait, that George IV was a handsome and fashionable young man who was also very, very charming. So he wasn't without gifts. He wasn't just a wastrel and a spendthrift. He was I think, a good companion, an enjoyable person to be around, but I think also somebody who, in some respects, was quite skillful in a political arena.
And it's interesting you said that he collected caricatures even of himself. I mean, that shows an ability to laugh at yourself, perhaps.
And a lot of descriptions of him describe somebody very charming, but somebody who is not going to stand on ceremony, somebody who could be very easygoing, put everybody at their ease, and so on. Yeah, and laugh at themselves, therefore.
And he had a very notable collection of prints, didn't he? I mean, that's a side of his collecting that tends to have been left out of the picture slightly. And I think one of the interesting things about the exhibition was that you did bring this more into the foreground, the importance of his print collecting, as well as his collecting of the other things that we've known about for a long time, like French furniture and Sèvres porcelain and so forth.
Yes, exactly. And that's one of the points that one of the curators of the exhibition, Kate Hurd, really wanted to draw attention to the fact that George IV is not some kind of empty-headed man. I mean, probably imprudent and not very financially responsible and all those kinds of things. All that's true, but that he wasn't an idiot at all. And she really wanted to draw attention in those prints that you were talking about to his wide range of intellectual interests. And I think one of the clever things is the way in which the exhibition draws attention to his interest in particularly the great absolute monarchies of history. He, on the one hand, he's a kind of lad that's a friend of Sheridan and Fox and a bit of a radical. On the other hand, he's somebody who's very interested in what a proper absolute monarchy should look like, and he particularly likes imperial Rome, papal Rome, surprisingly, and the France of Louis XIV. Those are his sort of go-to examples of how countries should be run.
Do you think that's something that runs all the way through his collecting career, or do you think things change slightly as he becomes a little bit more conservative politically?
I think probably it runs all the way through his career, but I think there's a difference between what, as a young man, would be a purely intellectual interest. He'd be collecting memorabilia and material from those periods, and once he becomes king, he's actually trying to put it into practice. He really does want to create the kind of, I think, the stage at least for an absolute monarchy. I don't mean that he wanted to create the actual substance of an absolute monarchy, but I think he wanted to make Britain look a little bit like it was a proper monarchy.
So let's just step into the first room in the exhibition and tell us about what's in this first room.
Yeah, well, this is as we look at it, we're looking back, as it were. We've come through the room and we're looking backwards. And on the left-hand side, as we look at it, you have a whole a range of material, much of it on paper, dealing with the kind of interest you would have expected of a young Regency buck. In other words, an interest in the theatre, in particular actresses. So you have, and it deals with his love life also, and interest in horses and in caricatures. So those are all the things that, in a way, you'd expect a fairly sort of thoughtless young man to be interested in. And then on the other side, we see more of this interest in history that I was talking about, particularly in the absolute monarchies that he admired. And you see, for example, these two Italian replicas of triumphal arches from Rome.
Didn't one of them form the prototype for what is now Marble Arch, which was in front of Buckingham Palace?
Exactly that. So there's a very direct link between this papal imagery and Marble Arch, which was part of Buckingham Palace. It closed the courtyard of Buckingham Palace with a triumphal arch, which was a completely novel way of articulating a palace in England at this date. Well, in anywhere, as far as I know, at this date.
Not exactly an architectural understatement, one would say, entering through a triumphal arch.
I don't think that was ever his style, no.
So, thinking about the world of the stage and also his interest in music, I mean, you mentioned the actresses, and I think Perdita Robinson, as she was called, was one of his first great loves, I believe. But he also seems to have been interested in male actors as well. So our next slide shows David Garrick. So and also Haydn. Tell us about these, Desmond. Yes,
exactly. And I think this is one of the things that's interesting. If we're thinking of him as just a thoughtless theatre goer, it's quite surprising that from the collection of Reynolds's niece, so really from the artist's own collection, he acquired this portrait by Reynolds of David Garrick, which comes from a completely different generation than his own. He would never have seen David Garrick acting. So it shows a really serious interest in the history of the theatre, which is different from just going to a play to ogle some actresses, if you see what I mean. And it's he seems to have been very enthusiastic about this artist that his father had neglected, Sir Joshua Reynolds. George III wouldn't have anything to do with Reynolds, but George IV almost made up for his father's neglect by forming really quite an important collection of Reynolds portraits.
Thinking about Reynolds, and also Gainsborough, I mean, I think, didn't George play quite an important role in terms of the British institution and promoting their posthumous reputation?
Very much so. And I think that the business of buying from the artist's own collection, from the collection of the artist's niece, that's an example, I think, of him saying, I'm interested in Reynolds the man, Reynolds the great English painter, as well as his works. He did also commission Reynolds. He overlapped enough to get some very important commissions from Reynolds. And then the other work, and here we're looking at, is another example of him being perhaps a little bit more serious than you might expect. When Joseph Handel was in one of his visits to London, hugely successful visits, he played something for George IV, met George IV, was very impressed, and George IV commissioned this portrait from Hoppner, which unfortunately was not finished because Haydn returned to Vienna. But I think probably it was left unfinished because this effect of sort of bold handling was really rather admired, because the bits, it would have been perfectly possible to finish the body and hands with Haydn in Vienna. I mean, you just get somebody to pose in your studio and wearing a coat. So I think that it's quite deliberate, this very strong sort of manly effect of the portrait.
George was quite musical himself, wasn't he? I think he did a fine baritone voice, I believe.
I'd forgotten about the fine baritone. The trouble is, if you're a king, everybody's going to say you've got a fine baritone voice.
Well, perhaps he didn't, Desmond. Perhaps that's just flattering courtiers or something.
Exactly. I think you've only got to warble vaguely, and it's going to be described as Luigi Lablache or somebody.
Okay, so I think it's probably we can't really say too much about George IV without bringing in a bit more about the women in his life, and of course one very important woman in our next slide. So tell us about Maria Fitzherbert.
Well, this is Maria Fitzherbert, with whom he was illegally married. She was a Catholic, so they could not have been legally married, and was the love of his life. And this is a Richard Cosway drawing, which was actually recently acquired by the Royal Collection, and it's one of that sort of particular genre invented by Cosway of a pencil sketch with just a little bit of watercolour, so it's just becoming a not a sketch but a realised composition, and that gives it this I suppose intimate and a sort of personal character, as if it's a little keepsake rather than a finished work of art. And it also shows Maria Fitzherbert in a very characteristic pose of the era, almost as if she's a dryad or a wood nymph, as if she's kind of melting with the background.
But a rather intellectual wood nymph, because she's got a book in her hand.
So yeah, I think we think of that as probably a romance rather than a serious work of philosophy. I think it indicates that she has a poetic and sensitive spirit.
Yeah, good. And so then just moving on, so women, we've talked about the stage, music. Horses, I think, were quite a passion of George's, weren't they?
Yeah, again, this is very typical of the young wastrel. You expect them to waste lots of money on horses, and George was no exception, and indeed was involved in a betting scandal. So it was worse than just wasting money. But I think what's interesting about this James Ward of one of his horses, the Nonpareil, peerless, I suppose would be the translation of the name, is that it does show how horse painting is starting to take off as a genre in its own right. The pose looks a bit like Stubbs, and George IV did indeed commission a lot of Stubbs, but Stubbs has had that very sort of calm, classical kind of lucid appearance, whereas Ward's horse is nervous and romantic, and seems almost to express the character of the landscape. And in the landscape you see a storm and then a rainbow, so you see these kind of contrasting moods with Windsor Castle in the background. With Windsor Castle, exactly. So you're almost thinking of those very dramatic constables with Salisbury Cathedral in the background.
And also, I suppose, contemporary with Jericho as well. And
you can suddenly see what Jericho saw in English painting, which has always, to me, been slightly baffling. But you can see the kind of drama that could occur in English painting.
So our next slide shows the building of Versailles. Why was George particularly interested in this, do you think?
Well, I think this is the obsession with Louis XIV, and he had a group of Van der Merlen paintings, not all of them of great quality. This is a good one, and I think he's just obsessed with the idea of the sort of grandeur and the ambition of Louis XIV's undertakings, and I can think of almost no painting which so successfully conveys the extraordinary activity involved in building a large palace. I mean, the nearest equivalent of this painting would be depictions of the Tower of Babel, where you have 1 million people working on a kind of monumental and sort of insanely megalomaniac project. But here it's not the Tower of Babel, it's a real palace which is still standing, namely Versailles.
And I suppose it also says something about the importance of George as an architectural patron, because, many of his predecessors, like Charles II, were frustrated builders. George did actually manage to achieve things of real significance, didn't he? I mean,
he did, and I think that's a really important part of his story, really, and that we try to tell in the exhibition, because I think you mentioned frustrated builder. I'd call him a semi-frustrated builder, in that he did get something built, you're quite right, but he had to wait a long time to get started. I mean, he was endlessly tinkering with Carlton House during the time that he was Prince of Wales and Prince Regent. But that was a fairly limited undertaking. It was he complained that it was essentially quite a small townhouse, relatively speaking, obviously in comparison to Versailles. And it was only the last decade of his life when he became king that he had the opportunity to do the sorts of things that Louis XIV had 50 years to do. And he, I think, sort of bit off more than he could chew, because he set about transforming St James's Palace, Buckingham Palace, and Windsor Castle, and in the end, none of them was quite finished by the time he died in 1830.
Nevertheless, an amazing achievement. Let's move to one of the central rooms in the exhibition now, and in fact, in this room we can see Louis XIV rather prominently in an equestrian portrait. And what other favourite things that George collected have you brought together in this room?
Well, yeah, this is in effect the Carlton House room. So this deals with the era of the Prince of Wales and Regency, and it's, I suppose, dominated by a range of French decorative arts. That's the keynote. You pointed out the Girardon statue of Louis XIV. With the Thomire base specially created for it. That was a sort of highlight, both at Carlton House and then subsequently at Windsor Castle. But you also see to the left the Weissweiler cabinet, very, very important work. And in the distance, on the end wall, you see that little hint of chinoiserie, the chinoiserie which started in Carlton House and then was given a freer rein at the at Brighton Pavilion.
So let's just have a quick, slightly closer look at the Girardon bronze. Tell us something about, his fascination with Louis XIV.
Well, I think it's not. It's Louis XIV, the most powerful absolute monarch in European history. That's kind of easy. I think he also was fascinated in the tradition of craftsmanship and the decorative arts, which I suppose in effect Louis XIV launched, and which made France the prestige source of the decorative arts throughout the 18th century and into the 19th century. So I think he would have probably seen a kind of great tradition of furniture from Boulle through to his contemporaries Weissweiler and Riesener, and he would have seen similarly a continuity from the kind of sculptures and tapestries that Louis XIV set up at the Gobelins, and the great royal manufacturers like the Sèvres manufactory, which was going during his lifetime.
And very fortunately for George, as a result of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, he was able to acquire some of the great pieces of royal French furniture and porcelain.
That's the key opportunity, exactly. But I think here you're also seeing perhaps an awareness of, in this equestrian statue, which is a smaller version of bronze reduced replica of the statue in the Place Louis le Grand, subsequently Place Vendôme, which was destroyed in the Revolution. Over life-size statue, and I think you can see how Paris had these epic monuments to its monarchs in beautifully laid out piazzas and straight streets. It was sort of planned like kings had established themselves, whereas you couldn't find any equivalent in London.
But of course he did try and change that. A little bit, at any rate, with the help of Nash.
Exactly, and Regent Street was precisely the attempt to do something similar in London, to create a long street ending with a view of Carlton House, but complaining all the time that it's so much more difficult to get compulsory purchase orders through in England, where people have all these rights and liberties of property and all that nonsense, rather than just if you're France, you just
if you're Napoleon or Louis XIV, it's much easier. Yes,
it's a great deal easier, exactly.
Let's move now to Carlton House. So here we are looking at the outside. So would you like to say a little bit about how he developed.
Yes, I think the striking thing, this is the garden facade of Carlton House. I suppose two slightly interesting things. One is that the ground falls away. It's the site of Carlton House Terrace, where Carlton House Terrace is, and the ground is really, you can see it's quite steeply sloping from Waterloo Place down to the Mall, which meant that the garden facade, which we're seeing here, had 3 stories, and the main courtyard facade had 2 stories. So the basement became the ground floor, as it were. You can see that rusticated basement is that extra ground floor. But I think, to me, what is most striking is how unpalatial this facade looks. It doesn't have an order, a pilaster or a column. It doesn't have anything that gives that effect of sort of royal grandeur. It looks very comfortable and domestic with all these French windows, and very unprotected in a sense. It's just sort of open to the garden. And I think that's a character which is an aspect of George IV's architectural patronage. I think he liked a sort of grand castle-y, palatial thing, but he also liked a comfortable, cottagey, livable inn kind of thing.
Yes, and I mean this side, apart from the French windows, does look rather informal and English, whereas the other side was much more French, wasn't it, with a porte cochere and quite influenced by a Parisian hotel, as it were. Not a
I think
palace,
very
but
much
an hotel.
that, and very much the way that French architecture tried, again through Louis XIV, to kind of absorb the traditions of classical antiquity and become the sort of bearers of the torch of, the great tradition of classical architecture. So I don't think it's just French. I think it's kind of, imperial, Augustan. It's kind of grown-up architecture, if you see what I mean.
Let's go inside now. So we're now in the rose satin drawing room.
Yes, this is on the first floor of that garden facade. So we saw that polygonal bow window. That's that from the inside. So this is probably the grandest room in the house, overlooking the garden. And you see, I suppose, something like that assemblage of French decorative arts which we tried to create in the exhibition room, which we just looked at, except we weren't able to replicate all the passementerie. That's quite a lot of silk there, which we were not planning to invest in, but that which gives it its distinct appearance. But the range of French decorative arts you see there, we tried to replicate, and indeed some of those elements are in the exhibition. So,
because he's not only collecting old pieces of buhl, such as that table that you can see in front of the sofa, but he's also commissioning, isn't he, work from some of the great contemporary Parisian ebonistes. And employing, Dominique Daguerre, who is this great Marshal Mercier who'd worked for Marie Antoinette, to supply him with furniture. So he's sort of mixing the two, isn't he?
Yes, that's right. And he also employs English Tate and Bailey and Saunders, who can do a sort of French-style neoclassical thing for him, some of which you see also in the background there. The Dominique Daguerre is absolutely key. And with this role there probably isn't quite a precise equivalent. It's like an interior decorator or almost a decorative arts impresario who can put together commissions from Parisian ebonistes, as you say. So yes, very much so. But I think the other thing that's very striking for a paintings person is the way in which this incredibly grand and exalted interior with its very grand French decorative arts is a space in which the lowest kind of Dutch painting is being displayed. This, which is surprising in George IV, is actually also a surprise which occurs in a lot of aristocratic French collections during the 18th century. And what you see is a love of, I suppose, a kind of inner circle of 17th century Flemish and Dutch artists.
Here is one. This is an example, the Teniers.
Yeah, and David Teniers is absolutely central to this. And what it's immediately a little bit surprising because you see a lot of peasants behaving pretty badly, all groping each other and dancing and vomiting against fences, and you wonder why on earth would somebody want a scene like that in such a grand interior. But it's quite obvious that everybody loved this. And George IV particularly enjoyed this kind of scene. And what they really didn't shirk from is the comedy. They enjoyed the fact that this is a scene of low life. It wasn't that they were, enjoying the way it was painted. They were enjoying that as well, but they were enjoying the fact that there were all these people getting drunk and behaving badly.
Let's have a look at the next slide, which also shows...
Yeah, and here I think you see two other names in the charmed circle. These crop up again and again and again in collections throughout the 18th and early 19th century. Caret Dow, who was hugely admired for his fantastic detail and realism, particularly in his depiction of light, and I suppose illusionism. You can see this kind of fictive frame that looks like it's a stone frame immediately inside the real frame, and the effect of things as if they're projecting forwards from that frame. This kind of trompe-l'oeil cleverness, I suppose, people greatly admired. But they also loved Adrian van Ostade, so these kind of rather kind of ragdoll-like picturesque peasants in their happy surroundings. And I always think the one on the right, if you did a parody of that and changed all the features to Homer and Marge Simpson, you would just get exactly the same kind of character.
Good. And then two more, the Adrian van der Velde and Paulus Potter.
Yeah, and here we deliberately hung these together in this position in the exhibition because this is how they were hung on either side of another picture. So they were a group of three, so these were paired on the outside. And I think it just shows how carefully George IV considered the arrangement of his collection, because you have two similar format paintings, pretty similar in scale, but also they almost make a kind of before and after narrative. On the left, the Adrian van der Velde, a hawking party is setting out, so you have this very grand aristocratic woman riding side saddle going off hunting. And then on the right you have the Paulus Potter, two sportsmen who've obviously been shooting and they've wandered miles away from everywhere into the dunes, into the sort of wildlands, and they suddenly become a bit hungry and they arrive at an inn and try and get their horses fed and get something to eat. And you can tell that it's a bit of a difficult encounter because the inn is so incredibly squalid. You can see it's got a pig inside. And it looks to me like this old man sitting mopping his brow is the owner of the inn, who's just being driven mad by these hoity-toity gentlemen all making all their demands.
High life and low life come together.
Exactly. And again, every account of George IV suggests that he loved this kind of thing. He loved the narrative in paintings like this.
So if we just move to another room at Carlton House, which is the Blue Velvet Room, and on the back wall is, I think, was it his favourite picture, the Rembrandt of the shipbuilder?
Certainly one of the most important paintings in the collection, and acquired from a very, very important collection, acquired quite early on. I think it's about 1811 in his real, when he really hit his form as a collector of great Dutch art, and was always consistently valued as highly as anything in the collection. That's Rembrandt shipbuilder and his wife, and you can see it's in a group with some real big hitters in a room with only four paintings.
Well, that is rather surprising if one thinks of the hanging of picture galleries. And I don't think there was actually a picture gallery as such at Carlton House, was there? And of course the Royal Academy exhibitions, which were very crowded. And he just sort of picks out, one picture on each wall, and sort of surrounds it with a kind of textile frame. But it's very, very selective. Was that very unusual at the time, do you think, too?
I don't think not that unusual. I think the care with which they are displayed is certainly unusual. But I think my reading is that that in royal terms, at least, the very, very dense hang, that's how you hang paintings that you inherited, not paintings you bought, if you see what I mean. So if at the same date that we see this, beautifully spaced hang, and next door was a bit denser, there were groups of 1/3, but they were still very, very carefully arranged. That's how people hang the paintings that they themselves have spent good money on. When you come to have to look after paintings which you've inherited with the Royal Collection, i.e. in effect your father or your grandfather's paintings, you hang them in cabinets wall to wall, frame to frame, because you don't care about them so much.
So let's just move in on that Rembrandt, just have a closer look. So this is was this the most expensive picture you ever bought?
One of, not the most. I think the one of, yes, and it was certainly one of the most important. And I think that the thing that's interesting is that Rembrandt had been admired in England since Charles I had a Rembrandt had two Rembrandts in his collection. So Rembrandt is not a new arrival, but this, I think, marks the moment where he is elevated into the absolute super league, and so that he joins artists like Rubens and Van Dyck as a sort of central painter in the canon. And I think it's extraordinarily striking when you see this painting and how utterly different it is from the usual type of portrait which occurs in the Royal Collection. In other words, something by Van Dyck. Van Dyck's portraits always have this kind of aristocratic suavity and elegance, and this elderly Dutch couple are so awkward and obviously not aristocratic, so kind of hard-working and serious and I suppose down to earth in a way. And I think that's a very interesting. Whether that may belong with those scenes of low life, that it's not just low life scenes, it's also a kind of embracing of the hard-working mercantile class in George IV's mind, or it may just be an admiration for Rembrandt's amazing detail, amazing texture, this kind of vivid reality which Rembrandt can create, which suddenly starts to compete with the rather smoother kind of imagery of Van Dyck.
Well, the next picture is not of Van Dyck, but a Rubens. This was a picture which had a particular resonance, I think, for George, didn't it? In terms of who'd owned it.
Yeah, and this was also pretty expensive. So this is again in the sort of super league. This was acquired by Charles I. It wasn't originally painted for Charles I. It was painted by Rubens in Antwerp as a memory of his visit to England, and in it he depicts something which looks a little bit like the Thames with a bit of Lambeth Palace in the background. So it's a sort of memory of England with a depiction of St. George on the Dragon, patron saint of England, and St. George has sort of the features of Charles I. So it feels like a celebration of his royal host in England. It was subsequently acquired from Rubens by Charles I and reacquired by George IV. So this is one of a handful of extremely important acts of ancestral piety towards the great collector, the great royal collector, the only one really to match up to George IV in significance, namely Charles I. So it's a kind of double whammy. It's Rubens. It's a Rubens landscape, which I think was something that George IV particularly admired, and it's a Rubens from Charles I's collection depicting Charles I.
But in the intervening time, it had been in the Orleans collection, hadn't it?
Yes, so that gives it another patina of grandeur, which would always be important for George IV, and also draws attention to a point I think you made earlier, which was the opportunity of the French Revolution brought these great works onto the market in Britain. Without that, you can be the greatest collector in the world, but and with whatever funds at your disposal, but if works do not become available, you can't acquire them. So where George IV was the right person in the right place at the right time.
One of the interesting things about the opportunities which George had was that he could have bought any number of fantastic Italian pictures from the Orléans collection. All those Titians and Veroneses, some of which ended up in the National Gallery. And yet this seems to be one of the few pictures that he buys from the Orléans collection. How do you explain that?
Not interested in Italian, absolutely. Early on, there are one or two in his collection, and I think there are quite a few people that tried to get him interested in Italian art, but it never quite took off. And difficult to explain, but I think I would have said that he, relatively speaking, came late to painting collecting. He starts acquiring really important things, old masters, probably from about 1810 onwards. And I think that he maybe was a little bit intimidated by Italian art. It came with such an apparatus of discernment and connoisseurship and uncertainty. And the type of art which he loved, Dutch and Flemish painting, I think has a character which is very much what you see is what you get. Rembrandt, you can see that it's very well painted. You can see it's very realistic. And he was extremely fussy also about condition. So his Dutch pictures, you could see that their technique was flawless and their condition was flawless. So I think he found that a little bit reassuring. Where some... I think there was always in the discussion of Italian art a suggestion that it might be a little bit complicated. You might get conned. I mean, I'm thinking right back to Hogarth parodies of picture dealers with Italian art.
Italian picture dealers humbugging Milord Anglais, etc.
Exactly that. I think there would be a concern about that. But it's very striking, certainly, as you said.
So, just as it were, as a grand finale, we've been talking about George primarily as a collector, but perhaps his greatest act of artistic patronage was the commissioning from Lawrence of this extraordinary group of portraits, of which the portrait of the Pope is generally considered to be the finest. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is how it differs from previous assemblages of continental royals, of which there are plenty in the royal collection. What's really unique about this was that they were all painted by a British artist, not just work sent by local artists. And the fact, I think probably because there were all these congresses in Europe, because travel became easier, particularly after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, it actually meant that Lawrence could have FaceTime with all these monarchs throughout Europe. And what Lawrence can do is to take advantage of a sitting to get the kind of lively engagement with the sitter. So you see the Pope, who's a fairly elderly, frail man, somehow looking incredibly lively and vigorous as he just turns his head. His face is very asymmetric, his eyes are flashing, it's just as if he's about to speak. And that, which was Lawrence's unique selling point, he was able to employ, not just with any old sitter down the road, but with the Pope in Rome.
And he's harking back here, isn't he, to a much earlier tradition from the Renaissance of papal portraiture.
Absolutely. He was known in Rome as Il Tiziano Inglese, the English Titian, and he's very anxious to show that he can get that Titian-like character, particularly the portrait of Paul III, looking very wily and shifty, but also, of course, the Velázquez portrait of Innocent X is very much a model that he is emulating. And I think one of the things that emerges during the reign, really, I suppose, of George IV is that English art starts to acquire a new kind of technical brilliance. I mean, I think when you look at Reynolds, you can see some great ideas, and of course, Gainsborough has huge amounts of technical brilliance, but somehow Lawrence has that, a kind of facility with the brush that puts him on a par with the great names of the past in a way that Reynolds didn't. You can see the Laocoon and the Apollo Belvedere, and I think part of the point, is to say Pius VII is a great art collector. This is a kind of common ground between Pius VII and George IV, and also slight allusion to the fact that George IV was instrumental in the restoration of antiquities which had been looted by the French. So it's a kind of tribute to that, to the victor's magnanimity in returning the, or making the French return the works of classical antiquity. But I also slightly think that there's a little bit of symbolism that the figure of Laocoon looks like a character experiencing the torments of hell, and the Apollo Belvedere looks a little bit like Christ at the harrowing of hell. And I think there's a bit of a suggestion that this is the Pope. He has the keys of heaven and hell.
Well, we don't perhaps normally associate George IV with these transcendental issues, but it's a very good way, I suppose, to end this fascinating survey of George IV's career as an art patron and collector. So Desmond, I want to thank you very much indeed for letting us know your thoughts about George as a collector, and I hope that this conversation will inspire our listeners to visit the exhibition when it reopens, hopefully in the early summer at the Queen's Gallery. Thank you very much indeed, Desmond.
Thank you, Jeremy. Bye-bye.
Bye.